Okay, patrons, what's up guys? A lot of you all have been screaming about PunisherMAX. We want PunisherMAX. When are you gonna give us PunisherMAX? Let's see PunisherMAX. A lot of you guys have been dying for PunisherMAX. And isn't it cool to get content that you can only get on Patreon? I think it's kind of cool, right? Like this is gonna be uploaded to a totally separate YouTube channel outside of Comics Explained, right? So like no one will ever be able to find it on Comics Explained. Like they'll never be able to locate this file anywhere on Comics Explained. Kind of cool, huh? Pretty exclusive. You guys are the superior Rob Core. PunisherMAX, written by Garth Ennis, is probably the coolest run on the character. Now, technically, it's only about 66 issues long. There are a few that come after, but they were written by Dwayne Swazierski, I think it was, or something like that. It wasn't written by Garth Ennis. And in reality, Garth Ennis's run is really just the best one, right? I mean, there was Jason Aaron's PunisherMAX and so on, but for what we're gonna cover Ennis's run. Now, this really kind of picks up in an interesting way, right? It basically picks up in essentially the Punisher out there just kind of revisiting the grave, more or less, of his family, right? Of the family that was killed. And most all of you guys know about the history of the Punisher in the sense that his family was killed in a gang shootout in Central Park in New York. They were just essentially caught in the crossfire, and that was basically it. But it was nuts because the way that Garth Ennis does this, right? He says, like, you know, they hated the old man so much that they shot right through my family. He says the world went crazy on a summer's day in Central Park in the time before Uzis and Berettas, before 9mm pop guns ruled the streets. And this is kind of what you get, right? This sort of explanation that back in the day that this was sort of unheard of. This wasn't really something that you saw all that often, you know, but the fact that his family was caught in the crossfire in the midst of all this, Frank Castle's world really just fell apart. And he says, you know, the bullet had entered through his son's open mouth, basically, you know, killing his son. And he says, that was our picnic in the park. And this is one of the coolest parts of the whole run. He says, and now every night I go out and make the world sane. And it's like, damn. It's awesome. Like, I love that, right? Because PunisherMAX just does this amazing job of like giving us Frank Castle and making him look like he's crazy in one part, but also totally sane in another. It's kind of interesting, right? But the idea here is that essentially Frank Castle is being watched by a couple of individuals. Now, what we end up finding out here is that the Don Massino Cesare family, or I guess really the Don Massino family, is basically having a kind of 100th birthday party for the Don. Now, the funny thing about this is that Frank Castle really comments on the nature of the mafia, right? And he says being called a Don in this day and age doesn't really mean anything, right? It's not the 1930s and the 1940s where being a mafia boss meant that you were like big stuff, right? Because you've got the FBI monitoring you. If you're somebody who has operations both in the United States and abroad, then you've got the CIA keeping an eye on you, right? So like the entire anti-mob task force, things like that. You know, the more advanced law enforcement became, the more difficult it was for the mob to operate in such a brazen and open capacity the way that they used to. So being a Don doesn't really matter as much as it used to. It doesn't really matter that much anymore. And it's kind of crazy because Punisher sort of looks at this and says, this is the best thing I could have possibly had, right? Like everybody is all in one spot. All the who's who of the mob world are all here. And that's kind of the nuts thing because the Punisher's like, okay, so we're basically we're gonna sort this out. So immediately he goes running into the house, right? He goes running into this place and he says, Massimo Cesare, I'm here to kill you. And then shoots the guy in the face, right? Like shoots him in the head and basically like blows his brains out of the back of his head. Now, looking at this, the initial thought would be, okay, so like Punisher's gonna die, right? He's basically in like this giant house filled with like all these mobsters. They're all gonna kill him. That's not what happens, right? He says a couple of seconds of shock, a couple of seconds to get pissed, a little longer to get everyone out the door, and that's all I'm going to need. And then as soon as all these guys come pouring out, the Punisher unloads on all of them with an M60, right? He's like, it's Omaha Beach, Wounded Knee, it's Works Drift, the Killing Fields, the First Day on the Somme. Like basically it's like, this is a war, right? And I'm spraying every last one of these down, you know, and it's crazy. He's like, it's World War III in North Jersey. And only now, pouring automatic fire into a human wall, do I feel something like peace. That's crazy. That's absolutely nuts, right? It's kind of wild to see, right? To see the Punisher just unloading in all this way. While this is going on, everybody's just panicking and fleeing for their fucking lives. And like everybody inside the house is just like, what in the fuck is going on right now? It's just it's an absolute slaughter. And it's amazing. It's one of the coolest things. From there, he starts looking around and he's like, somebody's been watching war movies, you know, these crazy assholes think they're gonna like sneak up on me, but they're gonna somehow get behind me. Like he goes back to reload the M60 again, and then somebody trying to get around him trips a claymore, they all get blown up, and then he in turn just sprays them all down with the M60. And so from there, he's like, I've got a fresh belt. Now it's time to basically finish off the wounded, right? To make sure that nobody's faking attacking. Fire at the moans, at the movement, give them the whole 200 rounds, right? Just spray into the corpses of everyone. And it is brutal, right? It is absolutely ruthless. And it's kind of crazy because from there, we switch over to the people who are watching him. Now, the woman's name is O'Brien and the blonde guy's name is Roth, right? And they're basically being led by this guy who's essentially kind of running the show. And that's where things get sort of bonkers, is because this guy, Mr. Bethel, as they refer to him as, he's like, this is more than we could have possibly hoped for. And this is a big deal, right? The Punisher single-handedly took on the entirety of the mob and mowed them all down, right? They are all dead and gone. And it's kind of nuts because from there, they're kind of like, okay, so like they refer to this guy as Fat Boy. They're like, he really believes he can take this guy on. And that's kind of the question, right? Like who is it that they're referring to? And the person they're referring to is a guy by the name of Microchip. Now, David Lieberman, who goes by the name Microchip, really made his debut back in Punisher number 4 in 1987. Technically in Marvel Comics, they do kind of have a lengthy history together, but the reality is that the nature of PunisherMAX is that it is for the most part self-contained. You are going to see a character from the other aspects of Marvel Comics who's thrown into the story, and you're only going to see one of them. You're never going to see anybody else, right? You're not going to see any other members of the Marvel community outside of this one guy. So for the most part, and this is kind of the cool thing about it, for the most part, because it's self-contained, we'll kind of get an explanation of the role that Microchip had in the life of Frank Castle, but essentially nothing else beyond this really matters, right? And that's what kind of makes it pretty interesting. But they basically, kind of start talking to this guy, like Mr. Bethel starts talking to Microchip, and Microchip's like, yeah, man, if anybody in this place can take him out, it's me, because I'm the only friend he has in the entire world. I can prey on that. I can use that as a means to bend him to my will. And so what we end up doing is we switch over to a funeral, right? The funerals that's being held for all these various mob bosses. And there's a lot of conversation being held here on who's going to take out who, who's going to go after Frank Castle, so on and so forth. But one thing to understand is that the entirety of the situation is absolute chaos. And the reason why is because when it comes to the mob world, more important than any one man is the organization, is order, is structure. There's people at the top. There's one guy at the top directing the guy below him, who directs all the guys below him, who directs all the guys below them, and it goes on and on and on and on, all the way down to the street level people, right? The prostitutes, the guys dealing drugs, the guys collecting money for the prostitutes, things like that. There's order, there's structure, and it all works in that. It's very militaristic in that capacity. But there's nobody at the top now, right? Nobody's running the show. There's a whole bunch of Indians and there's no chiefs. And that's what makes it all chaotic, is because no one knows who they're taking their orders from. It's just do your thing, just whatever in the hell happens. The funny thing about this is that in the middle of it all, one of the cars explodes, and the Punisher basically had a bazooka and took the whole thing out, right? Like blew that car up and basically started freaking everybody out. And that's what he says. He's like, you have to keep, like, once you get the other guy on the ropes, you keep him there, right? You mangle his ears, you fill his eyes up with blood, you pulp his kidneys, grind up his ribs, you do not let up, right? The Punisher just hit a funeral is basically what happened. He just took out a mob funeral, and that's nuts. Like, it's kind of hard to believe the Punisher really just hit a funeral. But you guys see what I'm saying when I talk about how amazing PunisherMAX is, right? Like, it's the best Punisher story of all time, and we're only 2 issues in. Then that's what's so crazy about this, because what we end up doing is basically picking up with like O'Brien and Roth, Mr. Bethel, and they're all just kind of like, holy shit, the Punisher literally just used a bazooka on a car at a cemetery at a mob funeral. What in the hell just happened? The level of ruthlessness is something that actually kind of takes them by surprise, but that's how the Punisher is, right? The Punisher's just like, once he sets his sights on you, there's no getting out of it, right? There's nothing you can do to make it out alive. What we end up doing here is switching over to Microchip, having a discussion with O'Brien and Mr. Bethel and Roth and all them, and Roth tries to call him out, right? Like, basically, Microchip is saying things like, hey, well, the reason why he did this is because he wants them to know that there's no respite, right? There's nowhere they can go. There's nowhere they'll be safe. The Punisher will always come after them, right? It keeps them scared and it keeps them terrified. It keeps up the pressure, and that's where Roth begins to kind of haul it in Microchip. And so Mr. Bethel's just like, we need the room. Like, everybody get out. We need the room. And so then Roth starts tearing into Microchip, right? He's just kind of like, this old buddy guy of his, this Punisher, wipes out 40 some odd wise guys, and then goes to hit a funeral, so on and so forth. And what does this guy do, right? This guy hacks computers, all that kind of crap. This guy's not worth a shit, right? Like, there's no way this guy's going to be useful or of any value to anybody. And then right off the bat, Microchip grabs this guy's balls, right? And he's just like, stay still. He's like, I haven't done anything to you yet, but if you make me, I'll just rip your balls off where they are. He's like, I think you've gotten the wrong idea about me. And this is one of the coolest instances of how Microchip is depicted here, right? It's like, there's how you think I am, then there's how I really am, right? So let me help you understand what kind of person you're dealing with. right? Like, first of all, like, my name's Micro, it's not Fat Boy. After that, the next thing is I worked with Frank Castle for 10 years, right? He says this. I helped him kill over 800 people. Anyone that knows him better than me is long gone, right? I hacked into computers to help him find targets. I customized guns. I customized ammunition. I put him in the right place at the right time to kill the maximum number of people. The guy's a one-man army, but only because I made him that way. So when I watch him rack up 42 dead and 7 wounded, a ratio that should tell you everything you need to know, yes, I'm absolutely terrified, right? It scares me out of my fucking mind. And that's the coolest thing, because what this means is that, like, Roth and these guys don't really know what they're getting into, right? Like, they don't really know what kind of situation that they're getting themselves into here. They believe they know, but they don't, right? Because messing with a Punisher is a whole different kettle of beans. It's a whole different situation here. And so following that, we pick up with Frank Castle, who's really putting his ear to the ground, right? And this is one of the reasons why Castle's so interesting, is because it's one thing to go after a whole bunch of mob bosses, and it's another to actually garner intelligence, right? And that's really what this is. The guy went after a whole bunch of mob bosses, killed 42 different mob bosses, in fact, and so there's really nobody running the show. So now it's what's going on now, right? What's the aftermath of what it is that I've done, and how can I most effectively take out as many people as I can? And so what he ends up doing is going to one of these hookers, right? One of these women that basically feeds him information, tells him what's going on at the ground level, and she tells him exactly what we already know, right? They're like, it's absolute chaos out there. There's no order, there's no structure. It's just everybody out there doing things, right? You've got this one guy who's standing on a corner, and for however long, for years and years and years, some great big mob boss guy or somebody would come along, pick up money from this guy, and that's just the way it always was, right? Routine, familiarity. But with the guys at the top being taken down, now nobody's coming there to collect money. So presumably the guy's just going to do whatever he wants with it. Come to find out, what he's also done is he's actually, picked up this young girl from Poughkeepsie, I think is how you pronounce it, from basically up somewhere in upstate New York or New Jersey or wherever, in some small little town, got her addicted to drugs, and now she's hooking for him, right? She's turning tricks. And so in response to that, the Punisher kills that guy, takes his money, gives it to the hooker, says, give it to that girl, and then goes back about his business, right? Now from here, this is when things really begin to get wild. And the reason why is because what we do is we pick up with a guy by the name of Mr. Cavella, right? Now, Mr. Cavella is presented to us here as a guy who formerly had ties with the mob, right? But seems to have been too extreme for whatever reason, right? For whatever reason, he just didn't quite have what it was the mob was looking for, right? He was just too violent, or whatever the case was. Most likely, he was drawing too much heat, because the mob really kind of exists in its form and function based on, like, clandestine activities, not making a whole lot of noise. That's why they bribe cops and politicians and things like that, so that if a lot of noise is made, it can be swept under the rug quick, fast, and in a hurry. You scratch my back, I scratch yours, that kind of a thing. What they're doing here is they're reaching out, or at least meeting with a guy named Larry. And Larry was, at least seemingly part of the mafia, more or less, but he really seems to be more of like a clown, right? This guy's just kind of a joke. He's not really a guy to be taken seriously, because he doesn't take himself seriously, right? He's cracking jokes, trying to be funny, different things like that. And he's really in the presence of some exceedingly dangerous guys, right? Right off the bat, the way they talk. And the reason why is because if you guys ever go and you look at, like, studies of people who are in positions of exceedingly high levels of power, they never really get loud and rambunctious, right? They don't, like, scream and shout, different things like that. If they have any real measure of power, they just speak calmly, because they know that, like, people are going to listen. And if people don't listen, well, then heads are going to roll, right? But things get done their way, and it always gets done their way, because if it doesn't, then things are corrected so that it does get done their way, right? And that's really where this is, right? He's, Larry's talking to these guys, talking to Mr. Cavella, kind of cracking jokes, different things like that, but at the end of the day, what this does is this presented the opportunity for Mr. Cavella and his guys to essentially make their way back into New Jersey and to begin acting, as really as part of the mob again. And what this would do is it would put them in a position of control. And that's really what they're talking about, right? All the guys at the top are gone. So what they're saying is, we can come back in here and we can basically reorganize things. We can get things structured back to where they're supposed to be. But understand, once we're here, we're not leaving, right? We're not going anywhere. Like, we're staying here. This is not going to be a situation where we just kind of go about and do our own thing. We're not a repair job, right? Like, we're going to be running the show from here on. And the real question you have to ask here is, if Cavella and his guys were basically, excommunicated by the mob, how extreme could they possibly be? And do you really want them here? But desperate times call for desperate measures, right? It's like The Dark Knight Returns, when Alfred was talking to Batman and he said, you hammered them until the point of desperation. And in their desperation, they turned to a man that they didn't fully understand. And that's what this Cavella guy is, right? Larry doesn't really know what the whole deal is with Cavella. He knows some things, some rumors and stories and things like that, but he doesn't have all the information. And that's really what you don't want to go into a situation like this with, is half the info. And so what we end up doing is picking up with Micro and the rest of the guys from O'Brien and Roth and Mr. Bethel, And as they make their, as they're following Frank Castle, Micro seemingly jumps out of nowhere, right? With him and Frank Castle having been separated for quite some time, it seems as though there's some level of animosity. And the reason why is because Frank Castle basically pulls his gun out, and then immediately Micro pulls out a shotgun and then hits Frank Castle, right? Walks up to him and then pulls it, or at least, cocks it back once again, and then shoots Frank Castle in the face. With that being said, guys, we're gonna bring this video to an end. Thank you for being patrons. I love you all, and I will catch you all later. Mariah's looking at me like I'm crazy. Peace. Thank you.